So we're in chapter 51 and verse 17. And let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessing on all people in the world who work for the cause of peace. We ask for their success and for the willingness of the world to deal with peace. We also ask you to bring peace to our own society and end the shootings that have become just part of our day of life. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. I saw a program on the BBC tonight where they mentioned where the United States is the only country in the world where mass shootings go on like that. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. And you think of like other countries, they're having civil wars, and they aren't having this kind of mass shootings. Anyway, so what happens now? In this particular prophecy, if you remember correctly, we're talking about a prayer for the rescue of Jerusalem. And now this is kind of God's response to the prayer for the rescue. And he says, this is 17 of 51 in Isaiah. He says, "Awake, awake, arise, Jerusalem. From the Lord's hand you have drunk the cup of his wrath. The stupefying cup you have drained to the dregs." In the scriptures, for reasons that I'm not really sure of, but a cup represents suffering. And you remember in Gethsemane, Jesus will say, "Let this cup pass from me." A cup comes to represent suffering. And it's strange to me because wine represents shalom. But anyway, so the cup represents suffering. And the idea is to drain it from the dregs is that you have, I think you know the dregs refer to the, what do you call it, the leavings of what falls out at the bottom of the wine. You know, when they used to make wine, when you would leave the wine sit, you'd have a lot of stuff settle to the bottom of it. And if you've never heard before that, if you, in a lot of stores, gift shops, you may see wine glasses that are colored at the bottom and clear at the top. They were developed in Austria, so you couldn't see the dregs. That was the reason they put wine glasses that way. So anyway, the idea is if you drained it to the dregs, the entire punishment of Israel now has been exhausted. So Israel's punishment basically is over. And he looks at Israel now and he says, "There is no one to guide her. Of all the children she has borne, no one to grasp her hand of all the children she had raised." And in the ancient world, largely, now, you know, I shouldn't say that true because it isn't true today. But in the ancient world, people were always taken care of by their children. So that if you, that like you raise the children, and then when you begin to break down, then the children take care of you. And today, even if you have an extremely wealthy family, I know some families that are very, very wealthy, they don't take care of their parents. They do financially, like they could have caretakers for their parents and that sort of stuff, and they're taken care of very well. But the idea of the kids taking care of the parents is not a big thing today. Certainly seeing them taken care of is, but not raised. But the idea is that now Israel is ready, to go again with this sort of thing, but there's no one to do it. Like the children and everything have all been killed and all this sort of thing. So there's no one there. And he says, "Double disaster has befallen you, and who grieves with you? Pillage, ruin, famine, sword, and who consoles you?" So that as a person goes through these things, the key thing is who's with you through it. Like the child will, as a person ages, there's a lot of complications that come across physically and all this sort of thing. And the children then take care of the person who's aging. But this idea, there's no one to do that. And so in the difficulties, Jerusalem is really seen as alone and basically abandoned. He said, at the end of every street, your children lie faint, like an antelope trapped in a net, filled full with the wrath of the Lord, the rebuke of your God. And I think you know that when you trap, particularly, I guess I'd use the word skittish animals. Like if you trap a rabbit will wear itself out very quickly trying to get out of it and is just worn. And so they see that Jerusalem has worn itself out trying to fight off the problems that came as far as their capture and everything. And at the end of every street, their children lie faint. So it's not only that their children have been killed, but those who are left don't have the ability to help Jerusalem. Jerusalem is seen as gone. It says, so listen to this, afflicted one, drunk, though not with wine. And the idea is that they're suffering under their abandonment and destruction. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that in watching like people or I guess even nations, that once you begin to realize you've lost, there's a whole attitude that changes. Like you watch in the Ukraine, they're convinced they're going to win, although everything is against them. They are convinced they're going to win, and that actually empowers them. Whereas, like when you look at different nations, I'd look at Afghanistan. When the Taliban began to rise again, the other side of it just collapsed. It just ceased to be. It's just this idea that they were convinced the Taliban would win, so they did. I think I told you that they say that whoever is convinced they'll win wins a war, that's the way it works. It says, thus says the Lord your God, defender of your people, look, I am taking from your hand the stupefying cup, the cup of my wrath. You will not have to drink again. And so he says the cup representing the suffering, remember they drank it to the dregs. So he says, now I take that from your hand. He says, and I'm the one who's taking care of you. I am the defender. He says, I shall hand it to your tormentors who say to you, lie down so we can walk over you. When you study in the ancient world, they used to have a lot of very curious things they would do when they conquered a nation. And one of them was to have the soldiers lay down, the losing soldiers, basically forming a road. They used to oftentimes do this in Rome when they had triumphal processions returning after a battle. They would have the captives lay down and basically pave the road with them, and the army would march in over them, chariots and everything. And a lot of them would be killed in it, a lot of them would survive. But they would do that. So it says, then you make your back like the ground, like a street for them to walk on. So he says that's over with, the suffering is over with, and he says, now I'm going to take you by the hand. And I think what we watch in the history of Israel is that initially Israel relied on their allies. They relied on Egypt to help them. But Egypt didn't want to get involved with Babylon themselves. And then they relied on these different treaties they had to save them, and they really didn't. And so then they began to rely on their own strength as to how they could defend themselves against these. And they didn't have it. They could not defend themselves against these. And so what God has had them do is exhaust these different things they depend on. So the only thing they can depend on is God. There is nothing else. It's the last resort. But that's what he wanted. He will deliver them when they depend on him. But, I think the idea, when you look at it in spirituality, is that because God is invisible, we tend to rely more on visible entities. When we think of defense, we think of this will defend me, or these will defend me, or that sort of thing. But God isn't there, so you aren't able to deal with it. But sometimes God is like always the court of the last resort. And so he goes. So he goes on, and this is chapter 52 now. He says, awake, awake, clothe yourself with strength, Zion. Put on your splendid robes, Jerusalem, holy city. For no more shall the uncircumcised and the unclean enter you. Okay, the uncircumcised, the unclean are the Gentiles. But basically, I think in the Jewish tradition, we'll notice a lot of this in the Acts of the Apostles, that in the early days, the Jews and the Gentiles could not ever be together. And it's basically because of the food laws. That you'd be... an example of this in our own day is in, in India. There's a caste system in India. And the bottom of the caste system is the untouchables. And the untouchables, the type of the thing they do are street cleaning and stuff like that. But anyway, in the realm of the untouchables, the idea is that you're not supposed to touch them, and you're not supposed to let them touch you. But better than that, you're not supposed to let them touch any of your tinsels or anything. And for a long time, the really upper classes, like the Brahmins and stuff, would never go out to eat in a restaurant or anything like that, because you did not know who was in the kitchen. And so they had to stay away in that way. And that's part of what kept the caste separated. That's not true now, because the caste system officially was done away with by Gandhi. But it's still visibly, it's still powerful. But where it can't be seen, people don't seem to care much about it. So in a restaurant, stuff like that, they really don't. But this idea that the Gentiles would be there, and you couldn't function in Jerusalem without running into Gentiles. You couldn't, the whole thing. So anyway, he says, now they're gone. He says, shake yourself free of the dust. Arise and take your throne, Jerusalem. Loose the chains from your neck, captive daughter, Zion. So they use Jerusalem as an image of a slave. And they tell them to cast off all the chains and, come out of their slavery. I don't know how many of you have ever visited Cordoba in Spain. Anyone here? It's an amazing thing when you go into Cordoba. One of the interesting things is the cathedral. And the entire cathedral on the outside is covered by chains. And it's just really bizarre when you come in. They're like hooks all over and there are these chains hanging. And Cordoba was conquered by Ferdinand and Isabella, and it was the Muslims who owned it at the time, and Christians were enslaved there. And so these are the chains. They took off all the Christian slaves and put it all over the cathedral. They cover the cathedral on the outside. And this idea that, your captivity is over, you take off the chains, you put on the robes you had as a queen or as the thing, and you turn away from the way you dress as a slave. And what they're talking about here is the externals. It's a curious thing when you study in psychology that for I guess probably if you were to go from God knows when up till about the beginning of the 19th century, maybe near the end of the 18th century, you would find that this whole thing is concerned with externals. Like you take off the robes of a slave and you put on the robes of, let's say, an ordinary citizen or of a governor or of whatever. This all external. And you know, at that period, we began to study, and largely under the influence of the rise of psychology, is that today when we talk about those things, they are attitudes. So, like for instance, if you have let's say a woman who had an abusive husband, okay? And I'll use the example of one of these cults, religious cults. And you have an abusive husband, and all the women have to dress in a certain way, and all, you know, the whole thing, and the women are second class, and that sort of thing. Well, in the ancient world, they would have considered it, well, now you're free to live your own life, you're free to have your own clothes, you're free to do all this, and they would see that as the important thing. You know, we don't today. What we see it as the important thing is the attitude that she pulls out of that. Because you can have a person who's an abused person, who can live a perfectly free life, who lives under this thing of being abused their entire life. And an example of this in my own background, I think I told you that when I was a little boy, I was diagnosed with polio. And when I was diagnosed with polio, I can remember, I think I was 3.5. I can remember the moment the doctor said it. And I remember the test he gave me in his office about the polio. And my memories are all connected with that. And I don't know them sequentially, but I have these memories around there. But anyway, so I was in the hospital for about a year, and I got a shot every hour on the hour for the entire year. And when I left, after I came out, I was 30 years old before I stopped having a dream that I used to have rather frequently. And the dream was everything was white, okay? If you remember, early hospitals, everything was white, period. They never wore colors or anything. Everything was white, and I'd see these 6-inch rulers with 2 eyes in them just floating. And that was people who came in that were gowned and gloved and all this sort of thing in white, and they faded into the background and everything. And I would wake up terrified. And I know what I was waking up from was in the hospital. When I was awakened, it was for a shot. So whenever I would feel this terror. Well, this went on for years. I mean, the hospitalization was over by the time I was 5 years old. But the thing stayed with me. And so we talk about, we bring people out of the situation, but it isn't as easy to bring the situation out of the people. And so this idea of coming out of these situations, that it's, you see that with abused children, that they'll have the attitude of an abused child the rest of their life. They never sort of walk away from it. It's just a strange thing. And so now God goes on, for the Lord says, you were sold for nothing, and without payment you shall be redeemed. This being sold for nothing is actually what happened. When Jerusalem was conquered, what they were going to do is take the slaves from Jerusalem, and they would be enslaved in Babylon. But before they did that, they had a sale in Jerusalem where people could come from anywhere to buy slaves, and they were dirt cheap. And the reason why they were dirt cheap was then they didn't have to transport them back to Babylon and stuff. So they're very inexpensive, like they were sold for next to nothing. If you're familiar with the Armenian Holocaust in Turkey, you can see old newspaper advertisements where you could buy an Armenian child, let's say, anything up to about 10 or 12, for about the equivalent of 75 cents. Because they just went in the villages, took them all, shot the adults, and took them off and sold them. And the thing is that when you have a lot of slaves, then of course the price is very, very low. So he says, you were sold for next to nothing. You were sold for nothing. And he said, without payment, you will be redeemed. So God's going to redeem them and save them, but he's not buying them back as slaves. That's not the way he did it, okay? He says, for the Lord God says this, long ago my people went to Egypt and settled there as foreigners. Without reason, Assyria oppressed them. So he's saying, if you remember, you went into Egypt and you went in there as foreigners, and as foreigners in Egypt, you were enslaved. But if you remember, I had no trouble getting you out of Egypt. So he says, now you've been enslaved by Assyria. And the reason is Assyria conquered Babylon. So now they're under this group. So they're under the Assyrians. But he says, as I redeemed you out of Egypt, so I will redeem you from the Assyrians. And again, I'm sure I mentioned to you before what happened. The leader of the Assyrians was really Cyrus the Great. And when Cyrus came in, what Cyrus did was give the Jews their freedom and gave them enough money to rebuild their temple and sent them back to Jerusalem. And the reason is that Babylon had enslaved all these different people. And when Cyrus came in, he thought it would be better to get their loyalty by sending them back to their country and this sort of thing, and maintaining it that way. So, in fact, they weren't bought or anything like that. They were just, sent back. He says, so now what should I do, declares the Lord, since my people have been carried off for nothing, and their masters shout in triumph, declares the Lord, and my name is held in contempt all day, every day. So he says, I conquered my people, and they think that I'm worthless as a god because I wasn't able to protect my people or guard my people. So he says, my name is cursed and used every day, and so what am I supposed to do? He says, therefore, my people will know my name. That day they will know that it is I who say, here I am. And remember, I am is Yahweh, okay? Remember when God gave the name to Moses, he said, you tell him I am sent you. That's translated Yahweh. So he says, you're going to know my name because here I am. You know that I am here for you. And then they go on. It says, how lovely on the mountains are the feet of the messenger announcing peace, of the messenger of good news proclaiming salvation and saying to Zion, your God is king. So that he looks at the people in Israel and he says, now it's your God who's the authority, not these others, and this relationship you have. And the amazing thing, it's an interesting thing in a hospital. I find one of the funny things in a hospital is that if you're in a surgery theater, that when a surgery is being done, I think there's a certain point in a surgery where the doctor would be pretty well sure you're going to recover or not. And yet there's a lot of little things that have to be done after that. I'll give you an example of a brain surgery. If they go into a brain surgery and they're able to get the entire tumor out without damaging any of the rest of it, well, then they know. However, they still have to stitch the thing up, close the skull, stitch the skin around the skull. I mean, there's a series of steps. But as soon as you reach that point, a doctor will leave as soon as he can. Now, he will not leave until, what he has to do is done. But the reason why he leaves, he wants to be the one to tell the people, your husband will recover. He wants to be, that is the bene of being a doctor, is to be able to come up and say, your baby's healthy, your wife will survive, something like that. That is the bene. And so they want to do it. Now, oftentimes in the operating room, because of the time the doctor's going to have to spend at the final thing, another person gets to do that. But that's the high point of the surgery. Doctors love to be able to do that. Anyone would love to be able to do it. But the feet of the messenger announcing peace and proclaiming good news and saying to Zion, your God is king. The church uses this in the ordination of a priest. And the church uses this frequently during the year at different ceremonies because we are the ones as Christians who announce the good news. And we announce the good news of eternal peace and the people living forever. But the thing that I think is really interesting about this is that, like we talked about the Archbishop as we were beginning here, like he doesn't announce good news. What he's saying is not good news. And I think one of the fascinating things of Jesus is that Jesus will always deal with good news. And when he's dealing with a terrible sinner, he will always announce forgiveness. He doesn't announce condemnation. If he's dealing with someone who's really sick, he announces the cure. But whatever it is, in any situation, good or bad, Jesus will announce good news. And I think of the people who turned away from Jesus. Like, for instance, remember the rich young man who decides to leave because he doesn't want to give up the money thing that Jesus asked him? There's no condemnation or anything there. Jesus will not do that. It doesn't do it at all. And when you watch someone like Simon Peter with the denial of Jesus, Jesus made sure Simon Peter at the Last Supper knew that Jesus knew he would deny him, so that he wasn't ashamed to come back to Jesus afterwards. You watch Jesus, when Simon realizes what he's done, he realizes, well, Jesus knew I would do that, and he didn't abandon me or tell me to leave or anything like that. And so this idea of, in any situation, you have to figure out how you can bring good news to this situation, or you aren't carrying the gospel. Okay? And there can be thousands of ways to announce good news, but I personally believe, this is a personal opinion, if you do not know how to speak about a situation or do not know how to speak to a person to somehow couch it in good news, you aren't the one to speak to them. You should just keep your mouth shut, because there should be someone who has the ability to do that. And to be aware that it is our job to be bringing good news, okay? So like if I go back to the medical thing, it is our job to be able to go and tell the family that their child has been cured or has gotten well or is going to survive the operation. That's our job. And essentially what we do in the faith is that, if you look in at the sacraments, to me that's essentially what the sacraments are, that in baptism you announce to a person that your life will not end in death. You're going to live forever, period. That's the announcement of baptism. And you go to reconciliation. The announcement of reconciliation is you've made a mistake, you've sinned, it's over, it's gone. Go on with your life. And the announcement of the Eucharist is that God is always with you. He's not away from you. He is. But every one of the sacraments is actually an announcement of good news, essentially. And we need to be a church that announces good news. That's why we're here, And if you look in the world, there are not many places where good news is announced. That's why it's great. It's our job. That's what we're supposed to be about, and find ways to couch everything in terms of good news, not to couch things in. I remember there's a famous discussion that Bishop Sheen was having with. I think, I don't know if you know this, but Bishop Sheen's field was not theology. Bishop Sheen's field was philosophy. And he was a great speaker in very reasonable ways. But I remember the one time that he was having a discussion with a person about belief in the existence of God. And Sheen was talking about why he believed and this sort of thing. And the man said, I just cannot believe in the existence of God. And Sheen says, that's not really important. What's important is he believes in your existence. And went on. And that's an announcement of good news, that you work out whether or not you believe in God or how you believe in God. You work all that out on your own. But the important thing is he believes in you. And that's established. You don't have to worry about that. But this idea to constantly, in every situation, to find a way to bring good news, that's the job of Christians. If we took that job very seriously, I doubt if there'd be many people outside the Christian community. If all we were doing was good news, you think everyone would be around. He says, your watchmen raise their voices, shouting for joy together, for with their own eyes they have seen the Lord returning to Zion. So he says, your watchmen, the watchmen are the people on the towers in the city. So they're on the towers in the city, and they look down and they see what's coming is not a conqueror, but a deliverer. And see, when they watched Cyrus advancing against Babylon, they were terrified. But when he conquered, then he's the one who gave them the money to rebuild the temple and sent them back to Jerusalem. So as they're watching him come, they think they're looking at an enemy and a conqueror. But they were looking at a friend and a deliverer. They just didn't know it. Okay? So he says the people who are watching, they're really watching the deliverer come. He says, break into shouts of joy together, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has had mercy on his people, and he has redeemed Jerusalem. Now, the ruins of Jerusalem, of course, the city has been destroyed and this sort of thing. But when the city is reborn, for instance, then it's rebuilt. When you study historically, the most magnificent temple in Jerusalem was the one built by Herod the Great, which each time they rebuilt the temple was bigger. And so Herod's was the last, it was the biggest and the most magnificent. And this idea of it being, reborn or rebuilt. I remember a very curious thing during the war in where was it, Lebanon, where there was a Christian-Muslim war in Lebanon. There was a man living in Lebanon, a very, very wealthy Christian man who had actually, in a private collection in his home, the largest collection of ancient weapons in the entire world, as far as guns, as far as swords, he had the largest collection, and a full half of his house was a museum of this. And the Muslims attacked it and burned it to the ground when he was there. And a guy from one of the news things was interviewing him, and he was looking at the ruins of the house and everything. And the guy talked a little bit about what had been lost and everything. And the commentator said, it's really the most horrible thing that's been destroyed. And he looked at the guy and said, no. He said, the horrible thing would be if I was destroyed. I built it once, I can build it again. And that's kind of how God is, like with regards to sin. They think it's horrible, like with regards to sin. Yeah, it's horrible, but God created me innocent, and he can recreate me innocent. God created me strong. He could create me stronger. That this whole idea that my power is not who I am or what's going on. My power is the God who I can always turn to, and this sort of thing. So he says, the Lord has bared his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. And the visual image here is, in the ancient world, there were two kinds of fighting, and the major form of fighting, like, was wrestling. That was, and I don't mean, like, of course, wars were fights and everything, but the major way of fighting between individuals would be wrestling. And there were certain rules for wrestling in different, societies. Greek wrestling, for instance, never employs anything below the waist, that you can't even touch the body below the waist. The Greek wrestling, you could just, touch the arms, the shoulders, the head, that sort of stuff. And you can't, like in wrestling, there's some holds where you can lock the person with your legs. Can't do that in Greek wrestling either. Nothing below the waist is involved in Greek wrestling. But they used to have different rules. But this idea that you come up to have the wrestling match and bears his arm, well, the idea that's the taking off the robe. And when he takes off the robe, you see the size of his arms, and you decide, no, I don't think I'll go into this, But that's basically what he's talking about. He says God has bared his arm. And how does God bear his arm? Well, God bears his arm basically with the idea of Cyrus. That what Cyrus was coming was to deliver the Jews. That's how God bared his arm. God bared his arm in Moses. Well, Moses came to deliver them with Egypt. All of Egypt was conquered by the power of this arm. And so this idea that God has ways of showing his power, and he bears his holy arm is the term used. He says, away, away, get out of there, touch nothing unclean. And this idea of coming in and throwing the Gentiles out of Jerusalem. And the Gentiles, the city of Jerusalem, because it had been basically destroyed by the Babylonians, like shepherds who would be out with a flock of sheep may rest in the ruins of Jerusalem, but no one would live there, okay, because it isn't safe. You have to be in a walled city for safety. So Jerusalem didn't have that. So he says, get out of here, and he says, you're to touch nothing unclean. So the Jews, as they go in there, to touch nothing unclean. He says, get out of her, purify yourselves, you who carry the things of the Lord. And so he's talking to the Jews now. He says, now you leave Babylon, and you carry the things of the Lord. The things of the Lord, essentially, in Babylon, would be the scriptures. And the beginning of really the writing of the scriptures took place during the Babylonian captivity. Because if you look at Judaism, before they were in Babylon, the center of Judaism was the temple and temple worship and priesthood. But while they were in Babylon, they did not have the temple. The priesthood could not function, so it really didn't exist. But what did function was they had the scriptures, and they taught the scriptures. And that was the beginning of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were not priests, but people who taught the scriptures. And so when they come back, their treasure is no longer what we would call the treasures from the temple. Their treasure is the scripture. And if you look at Judaism today, they have no priesthood, but the rabbis are the descendants of the Pharisees. So their Babylonian captivity is what enabled Judaism to survive to today. If it hadn't had that, they wouldn't have survived. It would have all ended there. So anyway, carry these things. He says, you are not to depart in haste, and you are not to leave like fugitives. And the idea is that when you're running away from people, you want to get away as quick as possible. He says you're not to depart that way. He says you're to go out in order, and you're to carry these sacred books. And the idea is you aren't fleeing anything. You're being delivered by God. And they did. We'll watch as the book goes on, not so much in this book, but in the history, you will watch that the Jews left probably over a period of about 30 years. The Jews would be just going out of Babylon. Anyone who wanted to would go out. And one of the things that happens in the history of Israel is that when Israel is attacked, and I'll take the Second World War, when the Jews were attacked, they spread out in a diaspora. Well, once the country of Israel was established, there were people who, they actually returned to Israel. But the bulk of them, stayed wherever they were. And so that, there's a huge, there are probably more Jews, that the only city in the world that has more Jews than New York is Tel Aviv. Not even Jerusalem has more Jews than New York. But the only city in the world is Tel Aviv. And this idea that there are these pockets of Jews throughout the world who, during their diaspora, became very successful where they were, and then didn't go back when the diaspora was over. And so they would leave over a period of time. He says, you're not to leave like fugitives, for the Lord marches at your head, and the Lord of Israel is your rear guard. So the Lord is before you, and the Lord is behind you. Now we begin the fourth of what are called the Songs of the Servant. And we'll just begin this. The Songs of the Servant are considered direct prophecies of the Messiah by the Jews. And we would see them as direct prophecies of Jesus. And you can read it in it. He says, look, my servant will prosper. He will be lifted up, will rise to great heights. I'd like you to notice this thing, lifted up. The lifted up can mean two very different and opposite things. Lifted up can refer to crucifixion, and lifted up can refer to being promoted. And where you would see this is the story of Joseph, when Joseph is in, Joseph is in Egypt. So when Joseph is in Egypt, if you remember, there were two servants of Pharaoh who ended up in prison with him, and they both had dreams. And so they came to Pharaoh, and the wine merchant gave him his dream, and Joseph's interpretation is, you will be raised up, you'll be returned to your position. He was the head wine steward in Pharaoh's thing. The other one was the baker, and the baker came in, and the baker gave his dream, and when he finished, Joseph said, you will be lifted up, you will be hung. And so he was to be killed. And so the idea is lifted up can have both meanings. And when Jesus speaks in three of the accounts, the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, Luke, he will say three times, when I am lifted up, I will draw everyone to myself. And is that a prophecy of the crucifixion or a prophecy of his glorification in the resurrection? And the answer is both. It is absolutely both. And so we see that here. He says, just as many people were appalled at him, he was so inhumanly disfigured that he no longer looked like a man. so will he astonish the nations. They say, as shocked as they were at the appearance of Jesus, think in terms of the crucifixion. As shocked as they were at the appearance of Jesus, they will be just as shocked at how powerful he is at the end. And he comes to his position. Okay? He says, so they will be just as astonished at how bad he is, at how good he is. Okay? He says, kings will keep silence before him, for they shall see what had never been told and understand what they had never heard. And this idea that in the presence of Jesus, what do they discover? Well, I would connect a lot of this with the teaching of Jesus and the good news and that sort of thing. But the way that traditionally they connect this is to the resurrection. That in everything they've seen happen, they have never seen anyone walk away from their own tomb. Okay? Now, in the scriptures, we see a number of times people raised who've died, but not raised who've been buried. That's a very different thing. Okay? So in Jesus, they see something that they have never, ever seen before, which is to walk away from his own grave. Okay? So we'll call it there and begin with chapter 53 next week. And the 3 is a continuation of this fourth of the servant songs. We'll see if there's any questions.